Racist cops arrest black woman. Their faces drop when they learn she's the lawyer. A black woman was handcuffed late at night. She didn't resist. The officers laughed until they glanced at her file. And within minutes, chaos erupted inside the Montgomery police station. Who was she? And why did the truth behind this arrest send shockwaves through an entire city? Get ready. The story you're about to hear will change the way you see justice. Forever. The night did not fall quietly over Montgomery. It cracked open like a wound, bleeding sirens and fear into the heavy southern air. Celine Carter was almost home, her battered Impala humming low across the cracked asphalt, when red and blue lights shattered the darkness behind her. In the South, you didn't have to be guilty to be hunted. You only had to be seen. Celine eased the car to the curb, hands frozen at 10 and 2, the way her father had taught her the day he pressed the keys into her hand and said, "Drive carefully, baby, but drive proud." The officers moved with a certainty too old to be called anything but ritual. No greetings, no explanations. Only the cold, mechanical orders passed down from generations too stubborn to let hatred die. The cuffs bit into her skin before she could speak a word. But Celine did not cry. She did not beg. Somewhere deep within, stitched into her bones by those who had marched and bled and prayed before her, she made a vow. This night would not end in silence. They thought they had broken another soul. They didn't know they had just unleashed a fire. And by dawn, Montgomery would remember her name. Celine Carter sat in the back of the squad car, wrists cuffed, breath steady, eyes wide open. The city she knew so intimately blurred past the window, each cracked sidewalk and sagging porch a testament to lives lived under a weight too heavy to name. The men in the front seats laughed low under their breath, thinking the worst was over. They thought they had contained her, as if hope could be shackled, as if dignity could be reduced to ink-stained fingerprints and mugshots under flickering fluorescent lights. The truth was far more dangerous. Celine had not been built for surrender. She had been built from the prayers whispered over cotton fields, from sermons preached in hidden churches when the law called justice treason. She had been shaped by hands that had learned to create beauty out of nothing, and by mothers who had learned to hide their grief behind iron smiles. When the cuffs closed around her, they hadn't captured a criminal. They had provoked a reckoning. The patrol car turned sharply onto Commerce Street, headlights catching the peeling facade of abandoned diners and shuttered stores. To the casual eye, Montgomery might have seemed quiet, resting in the sticky southern dark. But Celine knew better. History here was a live wire, just beneath the surface, humming and dangerous. Marchers had crossed every square of sidewalk. Every brick had once vibrated with the songs of protest. It had always been only a matter of time before the ground shook again. The officer driving glanced at her in the mirror, a smirk playing at his mouth, as if daring her to speak. Celine met his gaze and held it, not with anger, not with fear, but with a calm so profound it unsettled him more than any outburst could have. She understood something he did not. True power does not need to shout. The squad car pulled into the back of the station, where the shadows were thick and the air smelled of old sweat and old sins. They yanked her from the seat, rough hands on her arms, voices low but sharp. Yet even in that indignity, Celine moved with a grace that refused to be stripped away. She walked upright, each step deliberate, each breath a quiet refusal to be made less. Inside, the station buzzed with lazy indifference. An officer thumbed through her license, tapping her name on the desk with a kind of idle disdain. Paperwork shuffled. Doors slammed somewhere down the hall. And all the while, Celine waited, not with impatience, but with the measured certainty of someone who knew time was often the enemy of the oppressor. The longer she sat, the clearer their mistake would become. As the minutes dragged into hours, as the smirks faded into sideways glances, as uncertainty began to flicker behind hardened eyes, Celine remained still. Still like a mountain. Still like a storm, waiting for the perfect moment to break. And outside those concrete walls, though the city slept, 1,000 small hopes began to stir. Hope stitched into hymnals and handshakes, into worn shoes and stubborn dreams. They had mistaken her for one woman. What they had taken instead was a movement dressed in flesh and bone, a future that would not be denied. And Montgomery, once again, would learn what it meant when the ground itself decided to rise. Inside the sterile walls of the Montgomery police station, the night thickened around Celine Carter like a second skin. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly pallor over the grey cinder-block walls and worn linoleum floors, which bore silent witness to 1,000 forgotten injustices. The officers moved about her with the bored efficiency of men who believed their actions would be swallowed by routine, invisible to a world too weary to care. They spoke in clipped commands, their tone sharp with the kind of authority that demanded neither explanation nor apology. Celine said nothing. She answered when asked, her voice low but clear, each syllable measured and deliberate. When they roughly fingerprinted her, she did not flinch. As they laughed while photographing her, she held her chin high. They thought her silence was submission. They mistook her stillness for fear. But what they failed to see was the quiet storm gathering behind her eyes, a storm seeded by generations of endurance, watered by prayers whispered over battered Bibles and backroom tables, a storm that would not be turned away by mere ridicule. They logged her belongings with careless hands, tossing her leather satchel onto the counter with a clatter. The bag fell open slightly, revealing a folder labeled Civil Rights Legal Defense Fund, and beneath it, a thick sheaf of affidavits signed by men and women whose lives Celine had fought to protect. One officer nudged the folder with the back of his hand, sneering under his breath about agitators and troublemakers, the old words repurposed for a new generation of fear. Celine caught his gaze, holding it steady, unflinching. She saw it then, the crack in the mask. It was not hatred that flashed in his eyes, not really. It was uncertainty, the first flicker of doubt, the subconscious recognition that the woman they had dragged from her car might not be the prey they had imagined, but a force far more dangerous, a mind sharpened by the law, a will forged in fire. The hours dragged forward like a slow bleed. Paperwork moved from one desk to another, each signature a small attempt to validate a wrong too heavy to justify. Through it all, Celine sat straight-backed on the bench, wrists resting lightly in her lap, refusing to shrink. She was not waiting for mercy. She was waiting for the inevitable weight of their mistake to settle, to force its way through the varnished layers of habit and presumption until someone, somewhere, realized that they had not arrested a stranger, but a sentinel of change. Outside, the night deepened. Across Montgomery, porch lights flickered against the darkness, kitchens hummed with late-night talk, radios whispered gospel songs and the promises of a better tomorrow. Somewhere, a mother stitched a patch into a quilt meant for a child yet unborn, and somewhere else, a boy memorized his Sunday school verses under a halo of yellow lamplight. Life went on, stubborn and unyielding, even as injustice tightened its grip. and in the center of it all, Celine Carter sat like a monument to the past and a warning to the future. They had stripped her of her jewelry, her belt, her briefcase. But they could not strip her of the thing that mattered most, her conviction that dignity was not granted by law, nor revoked by force. It lived, fierce and shining, in the marrow of those who refused to forget, who refused to surrender, who refused to yield. By the time dawn bled into the eastern sky, the officers at the station would learn what history had already tried to teach them, that the quieter a revolution begins, the more unstoppable it becomes. The first crack in the facade came not with a shout, but with a silence too heavy to ignore. Sergeant Thomas, a man worn thin by years of duty and compromises, stood over Celine's file, his brow furrowed deeper with each line he read. It wasn't her birth date or address that unsettled him. It was the list of affiliations printed neatly beneath her name: civil rights attorney, founder of the Montgomery Justice Initiative, litigator in Carter versus State of Alabama. The pieces began to assemble themselves into an image he could not dismiss. He stepped into the hallway, the file clutched tight in his hand, his steps slower now, more deliberate. Behind him, the young officers who had arrested Celine watched with stiff backs and darting eyes, their confidence draining away minute by minute. Somewhere deep down, they already knew what was coming. They just hadn't yet learned how heavy the weight of their mistake would be. Thomas reviewed the dashcam footage next, at Celine's insistence. No reckless driving, no swerving, no cause. Only the steady hum of her Impala against the evening air, and the voices of two officers inventing reasons to stop a woman who looked out of place. He closed the folder quietly, the sound louder than any gunshot. There was no fixing this, no amount of paperwork, no whispered apology behind closed doors could undo what had been done. Celine Carter, a name already spoken in courtrooms and community centers across the South, would now carry this night into every pulpit, every classroom, every hungry heart, looking for proof that change was possible. The sergeant returned to Celine, who sat where they had left her, her dignity untouched despite the shackles. Without meeting her eyes, he unlocked the cuffs. He placed her belongings carefully before her, as if by treating her papers and purse with respect, he could somehow erase the indignities already inflicted upon her. He mumbled an apology, but Celine did not respond. Her silence said everything. As she gathered her things, a hush fell over the room. The young officers avoided her gaze. Somewhere in the building, a typewriter clacked on, a stubborn heartbeat of the old system refusing to die. But tonight, that sound felt different, hollow, unconvincing. Celine straightened her jacket, lifted her chin, and turned to leave. She walked past the booking desk, past the officers who had misjudged her, past the doors that had closed too easily behind so many before her. Outside, the air smelled of damp asphalt and dogwood, the city trembling faintly beneath her heels. This time, it would not be forgotten. Because every time they tried to bury the truth, it grew stronger, rooted deeper, reaching for the light. As Celine disappeared into the slow birth of morning, one question lingered in the stale air of the police station, unspoken, yet undeniable. How many more times would history have to teach the same lesson before we finally learned to listen? The sun cracked over Montgomery like a slow drumbeat, warm light seeping between the aging brick buildings, brushing the tops of magnolia trees heavy with bloom. By 8 o'clock, a crowd had gathered in front of Bethel Baptist Church, the small wooden steps groaning under the weight of history and hope. Men in their Sunday suits, women in pressed cotton dresses, children clutching their mothers' skirts, all stood facing the makeshift podium erected beneath the crooked steeple. Celine Carter stepped up, her figure steady against the wavering heat rising from the pavement. She wore no robe, no badge of office, just a simple navy blue dress and a silver cross at her throat. Yet when she opened her mouth to speak, her voice carried with the authority of 1,000 unspoken prayers. "They tried to tell me last night," she began, her voice low but sure, "that their suspicion could measure my worth, that their fear could decide my belonging." The crowd leaned in, their breath caught in a collective silence. "But my worth," she continued, "was written long before they pulled me from that car. It was written in the calloused hands of my grandfather, who dared to vote when it cost him a beating. It was written in the soft hymns my mother sang while stitching together dreams in a one-room kitchen. It was written in the march of tired feet across Edmund Pettus Bridge, in the prayers whispered in jail cells, in the ink of signatures pressed onto petitions by candlelight." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, low and rising. They thought last night was the end of something. They thought if they locked me away, they could stop what was coming. Celine paused, letting the words sink deep into every listening heart. "But I tell you now, it was not an ending. It was a beginning." A rumble of amen moved like a pulse through the gathering. "We do not ask for permission to stand in our streets," she said, her voice lifting. "We do not wait for kindness to recognize our humanity. We claim it, we live it, we defend it, and we teach our children to expect it." The energy around her built, rising on the tide of every hard-earned victory and every sacrifice paid in blood and bone. Tears glistened on weathered cheeks. Hands rose, some trembling with age, others clenching into fists of quiet resolve. Celine stepped back from the microphone for a moment, scanning the sea of faces, faces lined with pain, but bright with stubborn, shining hope. "This is our Montgomery," she said, her voice softer now, almost reverent. "And from this day forward, we walk not in fear, but in the full measure of our dignity." The applause erupted not like a crack of thunder, but like the steady, gathering roll of a storm long overdue. And in that morning light, it was clear. They had not merely arrested a woman. They had awakened a city. If you had been there, standing shoulder to shoulder among them, feeling the ground itself seem to rise and breathe with determination, would you have had the courage to step forward too? The rally outside Bethel Baptist Church did not end when Celine Carter stepped down from the podium. It grew, swelled, and poured into the streets like a living river of purpose. By mid-afternoon, small groups had formed on every corner, neighbors exchanging plans, elders sketching ideas onto scraps of paper, and young men volunteering to canvass door to door. Celine watched it unfold with a quiet intensity, her heart pounding not with fear, but with the exhilaration of momentum finally unleashed. They decided that day, right there on the cracked sidewalks and worn porch steps, to establish a community legal office, one that would provide free representation to anyone who had been unlawfully arrested, harassed, or denied their rights. It was not just a dream. It was a declaration of existence, a bulwark against centuries of being silenced and shoved aside. Celine moved among them, answering questions, scribbling phone numbers, lending the weight of her expertise and her conviction that change, once begun, could never be undone. Volunteers pledged their time. Retired teachers offered to type affidavits. Grandmothers, who had once been too afraid to speak above a whisper, now argued passionately about zoning rights and voter registrations. They chose an abandoned storefront on Decatur Street 2 blocks from City Hall, a location as bold as it was symbolic. The place still smelled faintly of mildew and old plaster, but when they pried open the doors and let the sunlight pour in, it felt like consecration. Within hours, brooms swept across the cracked floors, hammers rang against the battered frames, and paint buckets appeared as if summoned by faith alone. Celine knelt in the dust and chalked the first message onto the bare wooden wall. Justice belongs to those who demand it. Around her, hands grew busy, laughter rose like a hymn, and for the first time in a long time, Montgomery's streets carried not the echo of fear, but the hum of something new being born. Watching it unfold, Celine understood a truth as old as the soil beneath her feet. Real change did not come from one courtroom, one speech, or even one hero. It came from hands calloused by work and hearts stubborn enough to believe in tomorrow. Would you have been one of them, standing ankle-deep in dust, hammer in hand, building not just a place, but a promise? Victory did not come with banners or parades. It came quietly, like a dawn that first grazed the edges of night before spilling gold across the fields. 3 months after they had opened the doors of the small, battered office on Decatur Street, Celine Carter and her team stood before a crowded courtroom. Word had spread beyond Montgomery, stories of wrongful arrests overturned, of families reunited, of local officials forced, for once, to answer uncomfortable questions. They had fought case after case with threadbare resources and an ironclad will, and slowly the tide had begun to turn. The judge, a man known for his stern disposition, issued his ruling in clipped, unsentimental tones. Yet when he spoke the words, "dismissed with prejudice," an audible gasp swept through the room. Celine felt her knees weaken, not from fear, but from the profound, staggering weight of relief. They had won. They had not just survived, they had shifted the ground beneath their feet. Outside, the crowd gathered in the sticky Alabama air, clapping each other on the back, sharing laughter made brittle by too many years of waiting. Someone began humming an old spiritual, low and sure, and within moments the melody swelled, rising into the clear afternoon like a prayer finally heard. Celine stood on the courthouse steps, the same courthouse where, decades earlier, her father had been denied entry and her mother had waited for verdicts that rarely favored justice. Today, something different had taken root. Not a revolution, not a cure, but a beginning strong enough to outlive even their greatest fears. She looked over at the building across the square, their storefront. It was no longer just a room filled with battered desks and mismatched chairs. It was now the Montgomery Community Justice Center, its name freshly painted in bold letters for all to see. A place where the law served the people, not the other way around. A place where dignity had finally been given a home. Tears prickled the corners of Celine's eyes, but she blinked them away. There was still a great deal of work to be done, still battles to fight, still hearts to mend. But for today, for this one beautiful, hard-won moment, she allowed herself a smile. Because this was how history changed, not in sweeping gestures, but in stubborn hands and open hearts, refusing to let the darkness win. If you had been there, feeling the sun break open above a city that had learned to stand a little taller, would you have believed in the power of small victories? Not every victory is shouted from the rooftops. Some victories happen quietly, stitched into the small decisions we make when no one is watching. Celine Carter chose to stand where it would have been easier to kneel. Sergeant Thomas decided to see the truth, where denial would have been simpler. And somewhere, in quiet rooms across Montgomery, ordinary people chose to believe again that dignity was not a gift to be given. It was a right to be claimed. This story is not just theirs. It belongs to all of us who have ever stood at a crossroads between silence and speech, between fear and faith. So I ask you, from the deepest place this story touches, if you had been Celine, would you have had the strength to rise? If you had been Thomas, would you have had the courage to change? And now, sitting where you are, will you dare to carry their legacy forward? Or will you let it pass you by, one more forgotten chance? If Celine's story resonated with your heart, if it stirred memories, dreams, or a longing for something better, remember to like, share, and subscribe. I was hoping you could share your thoughts in the comments, as every word you contribute fuels the flame of hope and reminds me why these stories must continue to be told.